I'm Dick Campbell from Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Welcome to another one of my Great Moments in History presentations. Since 1999, I have now created a variety of 12 history stories. And today I'd like to share one of these stories with you entitled The Story of the Lady Be Good and Her Crew. On May 17, 1958, a British oil exploration team was flying over North Africa's harsh Libyan Sahara Desert, searching for traces of oil-bearing rock strata, when they stumbled across something unexpected below: the wreckage of a U.S. Army Air Force aircraft from World War II. The man who spotted the aircraft was Ronald McLean, chief geologist in Libya, along with his pilot Tony Hunt. Upon return to their airfield, they reported the sightings to officials at Wheelus Air Base in Tripoli, Libya. The officials there did not investigate the sighting report, nor did they give it any importance at that time. A second sighting from the air on June 15, 1958, by Charles Hallowell and Ken Honey prompted another report, this time to RAF officials, and again, no action was taken. This photograph was taken of the downed aircraft by Honey from about 3,000 feet. 8 months later, in February 1959, a party of 3 oilmen, geologists Don Sheridan and John Martin, and a surveyor, Gordon Bowerman, were conducting a ground search of the aircraft and eventually located the site, where they discovered the remains of a World War II B-24D Liberator bomber named the Lady Be Good. The men found that the desert environment had preserved the aircraft in an excellent state of preservation. Protected from corrosion by desert dryness, there was hardly a sign of rust anywhere, outside or inside the bomber. The oxygen bottles were almost full. The plane's .50 caliber machine guns still operated at the pull of the triggers. The radio was in working condition. One of the engines was still functional. The nose wheel and one landing gear tire still contained air pressure, and the magnetic compass was found in order. There were some supplies of edible rations, a thermos almost full of coffee, and a complete desert survival kit. No human remains, nor were parachutes found on the plane. A maintenance inspection log on board indicated that the bomber's squadron number was 64 and that she was part of a Squadron 514 of the 376th Bomb Group. The oilmen removed items from the aircraft, including compasses, water bottles, a radio, weapons, navigational gear, and numerous other mementos. And after returning home, one of the men, Gordon Bowerman, did not let the matter rest. On April 2, 1959, Bowerman wrote his friend Lieutenant Colonel Walter Colbus, commander of Wheelus Air Base, about the discovery of the American aircraft, explaining how he and his friends had found it, and passed on all the known details gathered at the crash site. This letter is what sparked further U.S. investigation. Bowerman's letter was written almost 16 years to the day after Lady Be Good and her crew took off on their first and last combat mission. It contained information from the plane's maintenance inspection records and crew names found on clothing and equipment on the aircraft. Colbus replied to Bowerman on May 4, 1959. This contact resulted in notification to the U.S. Army Quartermaster Mortuary System in Frankfurt, Germany, which was responsible for identification and recovery of deceased military personnel. If not for Bowerman and Kolbus, the saga of the Lady Be Good might not have been known for years, if at all. In May 1959, a small investigation team from the Quartermaster Mortuary System was sent to Libya to search for the remains of the crewmen. This team conducted an extensive ground search and ground-controlled air search near the crash site from May to August 1959. During this search, items of equipment and several improvised arrowhead markers were found 19 miles from the crash site on an old World War II convoy trail leading northwest. The arrowhead markers were made from parachutes weighted down with stones, presumably to mark the crew's trail in an attempt to lead air-sea rescue to their location back in 1943. Still further along the trail, more parachute arrowhead markers were found. Not far from the last parachute discovered were the shifting sands of the vast Silencio Sand Sea, surrounding the plateau on which the Lady Be Good was discovered. Dunes are as much as 700 feet high, and the sand so loose that a man will sink to knee depth with each step. Despite months of searching, no remains were found, and it was concluded in September 1959 that any remains had probably been covered up by blowing desert sand. On February 3, 1960, 5 months after the mortuary system report, CBS television broadcast a documentary program about the Lady Be Good in its Armstrong Circle Theater series. Given the facts then known about the story, the show tried to explain the elusiveness of the crew's remains despite the prolonged and expensive search conducted by the U.S. Army mortuary system. The program concluded by suggesting that the remains of the crew lay buried under the sands forever. On a personal note, when I was living in Indianapolis, Indiana back in 1960, I happened to watch that program 56 years ago, whose story was one that has fascinated me ever since and led me to develop this history talk. Then on February 11, 1960, only 9 days after the CBS TV program, a discovery was made by another oil exploration team who found the remains of 5 of the crewmen from the Lady Be Good on a desert plateau at a distance of 78 miles northwest of the crash site. The skeletal remains were found grouped closely together, and nearby were pieces of equipment and personal belongings. Among the effects was a diary kept by co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Toner. His short, poignant diary entries for 8 days, from April 5 to April 12, told a remarkable story of the airmen's courage and superhuman efforts to survive. 2 of the desert searchers are shown here examining Toner's small diary shortly after its discovery. Here's a copy of Toner's diary account of their losing battle against sun and sand. Sunday, April 4, 1943, Naples, 28 planes, things pretty well mixed up. Got lost returning out of gas, jumped, landed in desert at 2 in the morning. No one badly hurt, can't find John, all others present. Monday, April 5, start walking northwest, still no John. A few rations, 1/2 canteen of water, 1 capful per day. Sun fairly warm, good breeze from northwest. Night very cold, no sleep, rested and walked. Tuesday, April 6, Rested at 11:30. Sun very warm. No breeze. Spent p.m. in hell. No planes, etc. Rested until 5 p.m. Walked and rested all night. 15 minutes on, 5 off. Wednesday, April 7. Same routine. Everyone getting weak. Can't get very far. Prayers all the time. Again, p.m. Very warm. Hell. Can't sleep. Everyone's sore from the ground. Thursday, April 8. Hit sand dunes. Very miserable. Good wind, but continuous blowing of sand. Everyone now very weak. Thought Sam and Moore were all done. Lamott's eyes are gone. Everyone's eyes are bad. Still going northwest. Friday, April 9. Shelley, Rip, Moore, separate and try to go for help. Rest of us very weak. Eyes bad. Not any travel. All want to die. Still very little water. Nights are about 35. Good north wind. No shelter. 1 parachute left. Saturday, April 10. Still having prayer meetings for help. No sign of anything. A couple of birds. Good wind from north. Really weak now. Can't walk. Pains all over. Still all want to die. Nights very cold. No sleep. Sunday, April 11. Still waiting for help. Still praying. Eyes bad. Lost all our weight. Aching all over. Could make it if we had water. Just enough left to put our tongues to. Have hope for help very soon. No rest. Still same place. Monday, April 12. No help yet. Very cold night. By Tuesday, April 13, all the ladies' men were dead. The first to die was probably the pilot, William Hatton, who back on October 20, 1942, while in Salt Lake City, Utah, awaiting his posting assignment, had written to his mother, quote, "There are about 4 places they can send me. I'm sitting here waiting to see which one it is. I hope it isn't Arizona, because I'm tired of sand," unquote. Well, several questions still remained. Who was this bomber? Where had it been before the crash? What happened to her crew? What was her story? The plane. The Lady Be Good, a B-24D 4-engine bomber, was one of 6,726 built by the Consolidated Aircraft Company in San Diego, California during the war. The B-24D had a wingspan of 110 feet, weighed 56,000 pounds loaded, carried 8,000 pounds of bombs, maximum speed was near 300 miles per hour, cruising speed 175, range 2,850 miles, and had a service ceiling of 28,000 feet. For armament, it was fitted with 11 50 caliber machine guns, and it was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines of 1,200 horsepower each. Consolidated was one of 5 large United States aircraft factories that built more than 18,480 B-24s, the most of any American aircraft during the World War II years. And in 1944, the Willow Run plant near Detroit, Michigan, was putting out a B-24 out the back door of its plant, one every hour throughout the year 1944. The mission, 109. On April 4, 1943, the Lady Be Good departed Solik Airfield, pictured here, about 34 miles southeast of Benghazi, on the northern coast of Libya, with her crew of 9 on her very first combat mission. She was the 21st of 25 bombers that took off in a sandstorm to strike the port of Naples, Italy. The 700-mile flight, which began at 2:15 p.m., would be approximately 9 hours round trip. The planes had enough fuel for 12 hours of flight time. Flight missions from Seluk were notorious for their high number of turnbacks because of weather and mechanical problems. This mission was no different, as many B-24s returned to Seluk shortly after takeoff due to sand-fouled engines, leaving the Lady Be Good alone and well behind the other planes. The crew had to make constant course corrections along the route due to strong winds. Having fallen further behind the other planes, the Lady Be Good reached the vicinity of the target, Naples, where the other planes had already dropped their bombs and were on their way back home. The Lady Be Good struggled on, but found the target too dark for bombing and headed back home towards Seluk, dropping its bombs into the Mediterranean Sea along the way. The Lady Be Good was now on her way back on a 150-degree southeast course towards Seluk Airfield, and unbeknownst to them, with a very strong tailwind. The radio direction station near Seluk received a call from Pilot Lieutenant Hatton requesting a bearing, and in 1943, RDF stations were only equipped with a simple rotating antenna which could not differentiate between an aircraft approaching the station or flying away from it. The RDF log recorded that a magnetic bearing of 330 degrees was radioed to the plane. The crew, believing they were flying against a headwind and that they had not yet reached the coast, must have accepted the bearing for what it was, 330 degrees from the station, meaning that they must continue to fly as they were already on 150 degrees, the reciprocal bearing, to reach Seluk. Both the crew and the radio station had made the mistake of reading off the back of the loop. Hatton flew on through the night, thinking he was still over the Mediterranean Sea and on his way to Seluk. So the Lady Be Good continued her fateful flight into the unknown and disaster. On reaching the Libyan coast, the Lady Be Good course, as shown here, was close to 150 degrees and heading southeast over the desert. Urged along by the strong tailwind from the north, Lady Be Good flew further and further southeast away from Seluk at a rapid clip. By 1 a.m. on April 5, she had been in the air for almost 10 hours, and fuel was running low. Approaching 2 a.m., the engines 1, 2, and 3 were running out of fuel. Only the right outboard engine was running. Hatton feathered the propellers on engine 1, 2, and 3, thereby automatically shutting them down. He then rapidly trimmed the aircraft so that it could fly as nearly level as possible on the number 4 outboard engine to enable the crew to bail out. Believing they were about to jump into the Mediterranean Sea, the airmen were wearing Mae West life jackets over their leather gear under their parachute harnesses and had discarded all clothing and equipment not thought essential. Virtually no food or water was taken by any of the crew on bailout. It's likely that the men were very surprised when they hit the sand rather than the water. The Lady Be Good continued to fly on alone over the desert. Long after her men hit the ground, slowly descending to crash land 16 miles south from the men's gathering place. Hatton's success in nearly getting the bomber to fly level, hands off, with the aircraft carefully trimmed, was evident by the almost flat angle at which the plane struck the desert. A search and rescue mission from Saluk Airfield to find the missing bomber at that time was unsuccessful, and no trace of the crew or aircraft was found at that time. Well, what then happened to the crew? Pictured here are the 9 members of the Lady Be Good's crew. Lieutenant William Hatton, pilot; Lieutenant Robert Toner, co-pilot; Lieutenant D.P. Hayes, navigator; Lieutenant John Worovka, bombardier; Sergeant Harold Ripsinger, engineer; Sergeant Robert Lamott, radio man; Sergeant Guy Shelley, assistant engineer; Sergeant Vernon Moore, assistant radio man; and Sergeant Sam Adams, gunner. After parachuting to the desert floor, 8 of the 9 airmen had managed to meet up with each other. They had been unable to find the 9th crew member, John Worovka, because unknown to them, his parachute had only partially opened and he likely died on impact. Not realizing that their plane and its supply of food and water was a scant 16 miles away to the south, the men estimated that traveling northwest would bring them back to the airfield in Saluk. They set out on foot with what supplies they carried, and by their calculations they figured that they were only no more than 100 miles from their base at Saluk. Well, in reality, the distance was over 440 miles. They were in an area where the temperature rises to 130 degrees during the day and drops to almost freezing at night. When the plane's wreckage was located in 1958, medical desert survival experts estimated that the limit a man could travel without water as no more than 25 miles under the harsh desert conditions, particularly considering the fact that they were unprepared for the unforgiving desert environment. But the experts overlooked one factor the Lady's crew had going for it: the desire to survive. And it would be this desire which would push the man to continue on to superhuman feats with the hope that the sea was just over the next rise. Miraculously, the 8 men who survived the bailout with only 1/2 canteen of water to share among them traveled for 8 days to the site where the remains of 5 of them were found, 78 miles from the crash site. And at that point, crewmen Hatton, Toner, Hayes, Adams, and Lamott could not continue due to exhaustion and remained behind. Shelley, Ripsinger, and Moore continued on in search of help. Charles Hallowell, of the Mortuary System Searchers, vividly recalls what they had found. He said, quote, "I can still remember the shiver that went down my back looking at the scene. For some reason it looked so peaceful that I remember thinking surely some of the answers lie here. Most of the remains were eroded by sand and wind, but the first object I saw was a USAF-type empty sunglasses case, partly eroded. The name Lieutenant Hayes was written inside. We had decided not to touch anything, but in looking for ID tags, I gently with a finger scooped sand from around the neck of one body, that of pilot William Hatton. I stood up and quietly walked away thinking, quote, there, but for the grace of God, go I, unquote. And it was an emotional moment for me. These were fellow airmen 17 years ago, and the conclusion for a mystery brought about by a chance flight by Ken Honey and me almost 2 years earlier." Unquote. The finding of the 5 bodies and the Toner diary, with its indication that 3 of the crew had separated from the group and continued toward the dunes, triggered the mortuary system's second major search to locate the remaining 4 crewmen. During their search, 2 British petroleum men, Don Livingston and Dave Glover, while surveying a route for oil vehicles through the sand dunes on May 12, 1960, came across the skeletal remains of Shelley. Standing over Shelley's remains, Livingston and Glover had deep feelings of sadness that someone so determined should have suffered such a cruel fate all alone, so many miles from anywhere. In describing the site where Shelley's remains were found, Glover said, quote, "From the top of the dune where we found him, and looking north in the direction in which Shelley was going, all he would have seen to the very horizon would be lines and lines of sand dunes. It is possible, I think, that having struggled up to the top of the dune and having seen what was ahead of him, he was probably overcome with the impossibility of walking much further." Unquote. Among the personal items found near Shelley's scattered bones was a Benrus watch belonging to him. Sufficiently mysterious to be worthy of mention here was that when the watch was found, it worked perfectly. And when tested later on, back in America under laboratory conditions, it was found to have only lost 11 seconds, despite its 17-year exposure to the heat and cold of the desert conditions. Also in Shelley's pocket were his papers and wallet. In the other pocket they found the papers and billfold of Ripsinger. This find implied that Ripsinger had died earlier and that Shelley took those effects to hopefully give to Ripsinger's family, if he made it back to safety. Shelley had walked an additional 37 miles north from where the first 5 bodies were found, marked here in yellow on this map. The amazing Shelley's body, marked in red, showed that he had walked about 115 miles from the crew's bailout point on perhaps 6 capfuls of water per day and virtually no food beyond a few energy sweets in his pockets. Then on May 17, 1960, 2 years to the day after Lady Be Good had first been spotted from the air, the remains of Ripsinger, marked in blue on this map, were found at an additional 26 miles north of the 5-man site. The Lady Be Good's Christ site is marked in green on this map. A copy of Ripsinger's diary, shown here in pretty bad condition, was found among his remains, which read as follows. Monday, Albert Woravka met this a.m., waited a while and started walking, had 1/2 sandwich and piece of candy and cap of water in last 36 hours. Tuesday, started out early walking and resting. It's now sundown and still going. 1 teaspoon of water today. The rest of the boys are fine. Wednesday, started early, a.m., and walked till about near spent. Terrible hot afternoon. Started again at 6 p.m. and walked all night. 1 spoonful of water is all. Thursday, tired all out. We can hardly walk. Our 4th day out. A few drops of water each. Can't hold out much longer without aid. Pray. Friday, 5th day out, and we all thought we were gone. All wanted to die during noon. It was so hot. Morning and night, okay, 2 drops of water. Saturday, walked all day and night, suggested Guy, Moore, and I make out alone. Sunday, still struggling to get out of dunes and find water. This was Ripsinger's last entry. He had walked 104 miles from the bailout point. The final search operation to recover the remains of Moore and Worovka was conducted over the same area without success. And by the end of May 1960, the search was brought to a close and the investigating teams left Libya never to return. Still, the story of the Lady Be Good would not rest. On August 11, 1960, another oil exploration party working close to the airplane's crash site discovered the remains of John Worovka, shown here. He was lying some 16 miles northeast of the Lady Be Good, face up, with his parachute piled on top of him, clothed in his flying suit, and Mae West. It was obvious from the tangled shroud lines around him that his parachute had failed to open. Amazingly, nearby were Worovka's first aid kit and his canteen, still 3/4 full of water, despite lying exposed to the sun for 17 years, both shown here in a display at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Following the discovery of Worovka's body, the team came upon a pile of parachute harnesses, discarded flight boots, and expended signal flare cartridges. These marked the spot where the crew of Lady Be Good assembled after bailing out. The distance between this point and the Worovka site was around 4/10 of a mile. The remains of the 9th Airman, Vernon Moore, have never been found, although it is possible that in 1953 his body had been spotted and buried by a British desert patrol, unaware that any air crews from World War II had ever gone missing in the area. The discovery of the Lady Be Good and her crewmen's valiant efforts to survive the Libyan desert received worldwide media coverage. Life magazine published an article on the Lady Be Good in their March 7, 1960 issue, shown here. At least 2 books, The Lady Be Good by Dennis McClendon, 1962, and Ladies' Men by Mario Martinez, 1995, and numerous newspaper and magazine articles have been devoted to this subject. Various items from the Lady Be Good, shown here, went to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Other collectibles went to the Air Force Academy in Colorado and the U.S. Army Quartermaster Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia. Souvenirs were also removed from the aircraft by search party members and various oil exploration teams passing through the area. The aircraft had been largely stripped down to its frame by the time the Libyan government in 1994 finally removed the last of its remains from the desert floor and placed them in storage in Tobruk, Libya. As a matter of interest, this aircraft was named Lady Be Good by a member of her ground crew back on April 3, 1943, just prior to her first mission on April 4. She was fairly new and had only 148 hours on each of her 4 engines. Also of interest, Lady Be Good was the featured song and title of a popular 1941 musical film, roughly based on a 1924 George and Ira Gershwin stage musical of the same name. The song was written by Oscar Hammerstein and Jerome Kern and won the Academy Award for the Best Song of 1941. The film featured Eleanor Powell, Ann Sothern, Robert Young, and Red Skelton. Thus ends the story of one of the most extraordinary combat incidents of World War II, and one of the most indomitable and futile episodes in the history of desert survival. In summary, the story of the Lady Be Good has been a fascinating one for many years, and one might ask, why? Perhaps because the story sticks to the imagination and refuses to let go, in a way few others do. Even 57 years later, after its discovery in the desolate sands of the Sahara Desert, the story of the fallen lady has somehow remained one of the most compelling tales of courage and futility to come out of World War II. The mysteries that shrouded the aircraft's discovery were simply too provocative and contained all the elements of an enduring legend, such as the stark image of an almost intact aircraft with no sign of her missing crew, the area in which she was found being so woefully far off the beaten track that 15 years had passed without a single human having discovered her, the slow unraveling and eventual heart-rending awareness of the crew's struggle to survive, and finally, the poignant diary entries found among their remains. But there's more to this story than that. It challenges us to measure ourselves, to question our own sensibilities, to appraise our courage in the face of as sudden and formidable challenge such as the one faced by the Ladies' crew so long ago. The Ladies' men were, like so many others, simply ordinary human beings who were suddenly thrust into an extraordinary situation, and who, even in the face of potentially fatal circumstance of their own doing, had to act as quickly and clearly as possible and think on their feet if they were to hopefully try to save their lives. Though the tragic miscalculation that placed them in their predicament cannot be minimized, what they did after the fact in their struggle to somehow rectify their blunder is an inspirational example of the unyielding tenaciousness and resilience of the human spirit. In the scope of what we now know to have been their unenviable predicament, hopelessly stranded in a very harsh environment, their attempt to save themselves was quite astonishing. Their endurance impressing even the most experienced desert survivalists. And now you know the rest of the story, and I thank you for your interest in this great moment in history.